Hey guys, welcome to the tutorial on preparing publishable figures using Adobe Illustrator. Adobe Illustrator is a vector graphics editor marketed by Adobe Inclusive. It's a US-based company. This software is usually used by graphics designers to make high-end graphics, but it has some really nice features that makes it a strong tool for making research of figures in research publications. So that's the purpose of this video. We'll do this tutorial in two parts. In the first part, we'll go over some of the basics. We'll try to understand what is vector versus raster. And then we'll learn how to make basic shapes and edit them in Illustrator. We will move on to seeing methods of how you can do some basic 3D objects rendition, which often comes in handy. We'll understand some ideas of layering, toggling, visibility, locking, etc. Basically, by the end of this, the first part, you should be able to make figures or shapes and prepare text within Illustrator. And the second part is where we'll actually see how to now use some of those tools to prepare figures. So if you have some research data, we will see how to make a one column or a two column figure, how to import a graph from Excel and insert into Illustrator, and so on and so forth, finally exporting the figure in an appropriate format. So we'll go over all of those details. We'll do this in two parts, as I said. By the end of both parts, you should be able to make attractive graphics slash schematics of various experiments that we do using Illustrator. And ultimately, you should be able to convert your research data into a clear and crisp publishable figure. So that's the overall aim of this. So let's get started by trying to understand what is vector and what is raster. So these are two different ways by which any shape can be drawn in software. A vector graphic, now what this figure is trying to illustrate is that when we try to magnify a vector graphic, it is completely lossless magnification. Whereas when you try to magnify a raster graphic, it pixelates in the sense that you can now start seeing individual pixels of data. So why does this happen? A vector graphic is basically a mathematical representation of a shape, meaning that if this is a semicircle, it is stored in the computer as some mathematical expression of a semicircle, and therefore you can expand it to or render it over however large a space, and it will be completely lossless because the same mathematical expression is basically being rendered on a larger size. Whereas a raster image is a set of pixels. This is what we discussed in our tutorial in image J, where a picture can be represented by a set of numbers over a grid. And because those number or the set of numbers, the number of pixels is fixed, if you try to render the same number of pixels over a larger and larger area, it starts to pixelate and you start to lose image quality. So that's the basic difference between vector and raster, and Illustrator helps you make vector graphics. So that's one of the power of using this software. So to summarize, a vector graphic is a mathematical expression. Some of the very common file types are .eps. This is probably the most common file extension for a vector graphic, but there's also .svg and .ai. This is the Adobe Illustrator format. The raster graphics is basically all of the other images that we are used to working with. Here information is contained in a fixed number of pixels, and these are the JPEGs, bitmaps, PNGs, TIFFs, GIFs. All the images that you've generally heard of are rasters. So with that, let's actually go to Illustrator. It's a fairly large software, so I have it loaded already. I'm using Adobe Illustrator CS5 on my Mac, but we also have a copy of CS6 for our lab, which has some features that are different, but I'll just do the tutorial in CS5 because it should be, you should be able to still use CS6 and all its functionalities. So let's get started. I have the basic program open. I don't have a single file open. It's a lot of different windows for a lot of different functionalities are open. We'll go to that later. I'll just start with saying file new, and here is where you get to set the size of the page that you want to open. Now one thing that I do is I always work with an 8.5 by 11, which is a US letter size, or you can work with an A4, which is more or less that, but I'm used to working with a US letter. Why this is important is that when you open this, you will get a canvas that is about the size of a piece of paper, and so now whenever you make a figure, you get a very good idea about how it will look on your final printed version, as opposed to making canvases that are only one column wide or exactly equal to the size of the figure you want. I find this to be a much better strategy. So this is something I encourage you to do. So just to push further on our idea of vector versus raster, I have a folder here with some files that we'll be using. So if I open a typical image that we acquire in our lab, you can see here, and let me just zoom into one part. So you can zoom into any part of the canvas by using Control plus and zoom out by using Control minus. On an Apple, it's Apple plus and Apple minus. So it's very convenient. You can zoom in and zoom out. And if you stretch this, and in the stretching by sort of dragging it just like you would do in any other software, you can very quickly start to see that this thing is beginning to get pixelated, because this image is a JPG. It's not a vector graphic, and typically pictures taken by a camera, any camera, will never be vector graphics. They'll always be rasters. What could be vector graphics is things like texts and shapes. So if I write something here, say ABC, and I'll come to the text tool again and all of these tools. This now I can expand however much and it will be complete lossless because this is a vector graphic. So this is just to illustrate a very simple point of vector versus raster. Okay, with that understanding, let me zoom out, look at this page. Let's go over some of these basic tools. The most default selection in Illustrator should be this dark arrow. There are two selection tools in Illustrator and we'll come to that. This is the most default selection tool, so we can start from there. And now let's look at how to make some basic shapes. So we will start with, now there are many features here. I won't go over all of them. I don't even know all of them. I'll only go over the features that we use on a regular basis for making figures. So let's start by making a line. This is as simple as making a line in PowerPoint. Click here, you expand, you hold the click down and release your button anywhere. Okay, so what happened here is a line formed. Now it appears blue in color, but in reality, if I go back to this selection tool here and I click outside, I don't see anything. So what happened to my line? So let me do Control A, which is select all. It shows that there's something over there, but it just won't be visible. So let me select that. This is happening because Illustrator knows that there's an object over there, but we have chosen both its path, which is the fill color, and the stroke, which is the line color, to be nil, as shown by this red line here. I can go and select black color here, and now I'll begin to see this line. And you can easily increase the thickness of this line by, the other way around, by increasing the stroke, number of strokes. Okay, just like with any other software. That's straightforward. Sorry. Okay. Once you make, there's two ways of making a line. Either you can start from the first end to the other end, or you just click at any point. That will make a line starting from there, and it will ask you what length of line you want and at what angle. So if I want a 2-inch line at angle 0, it will make it. So that is just the different ways of making a line. These are all basics. Within the line making tool, there is also an arc making tool, and this is slightly unintuitive. What you have to do is you have to click on the line tool and hold it for 2 seconds or so. And I'm still holding the mouse pointer down and I see all of these other options. So the only other thing that we use usually here is an arc tool. This is a very useful tool because this allows you to make customized shaped arcs. Okay. Now based on this alone, it seems like I don't have much choice because I can only select the first and the last point, but Illustrator is deciding what the shape is in between, right? So that's not very desirable. So that brings us to our second selection tool. So let me zoom in on this arc. And as I said, with my default selection tool, this one, what it will do is it will select the entire path, which is the entire length of this object. If I want to edit this, if I want to change the shape of this arc, I can go to my second selection tool. This is called the direct selection tool. What the direct selection tool allows you to do is it allows you to choose or select parts or points within an object, right? So if I click on this end here, see what it says here, anchor point, which means that I have each point in this, so this point and this point is called an anchor point. So this arc goes from one anchor point to a second anchor point. Whereas if I go back to my original selection tool, it will not allow me to choose anchor points. It will only allow me to select a path. And therefore you can't edit it. You can edit it this way, like assuming that it's a full object. But you cannot, for example, if I wanted to change the slope over here, I cannot do that. But with this other selection tool, I can choose an anchor point, and now you see that there's a handle over here. I can change the shape of this arc by stretching this handle, shrinking this handle, changing its angle, basically doing whatever I want with it. So it gives me complete flexibility over the shape of the arc that I want to form. I can do a similar thing with this. I can change the shape, the placement of the anchor point itself also. So I can keep the anchor point wherever, and I can move around this handle. I can even do that all over like 360 degrees. So there's a huge amount of customization that you get in making whatever shape that you want. So this is a very important feature within Illustrator. While we are doing this, one important feature comes in is, since we discussed anchor points, there are ways by which you can add or delete anchor points, and that is this tool over here, the one that looks like the tip of a fountain pen. If you long click on it, you can see a long press, you can see many different tools. And one of the things that we use a lot is the add anchor point tool. Okay. As soon as you do that, your cursor changes into this fountain pen tip. I'll zoom into our object. Now, as I said, this object, this arc is basically made by an anchor point over here and an anchor point over here. But let's say I want to do some tweak over here. I cannot do that with just the two handles I currently have. So what I can do is I can click somewhere, and that creates a new anchor point. So now I have this new anchor point and the handle that came along with it. I can go back to my select the second selection tool. I can click here and I can move the anchor point wherever I want, and I can move both of these handles as I like. Okay. So that gives you an idea. Now you can add as many anchor points you want. If you again long press on this, you'll get a delete anchor point too. And if I click on this, this anchor point should disappear. I might not have clicked. This is the anchor point here. Okay. So this is how you can add and delete anchor points. And this, as you can imagine, also allows you to make completely customized shapes. Okay. So that is just on lines and arcs. Moving on, we'll go to rectangles and circles. So this is just a normal, let's start with the clean canvas. So I'm zooming out, selecting. So again, whenever you want to do anything, exit, you go back to your base selection tool. I select everything, delete it. Let's start with a fresh canvas. I have a rectangle tool. As like any other tool, you can make a rectangle, whatever shape you want. If I go back to my base default selection and I click on this, it will always show a path. One thing to note is that a rectangle is always represented by these four numbers over here. So x and y coordinates and the width and the height. But what are these x and y coordinates of? That is decided by this thing over here. So because I can click either the top left corner or the top right corner or any part within this object. So if I click the top bottom, then this is showing me the x and y coordinates of this point over here and the width and the height. The width and the height will remain the same no matter which point you click. Why is this very important? There's a very useful transform feature in Illustrator. So let's say I want to make two objects that I know what their relative position to each other should be. So by the way, when I do that, when I snap things to place, you'll see all kinds of very cool guidelines come up. And so it snaps the object into place. Now let's say this is, I have two objects. I know that they will always be sitting such that the bottom middle of this and the midpoint of the bottom line here and the midpoint of the top line here will always coincide. And I now want to change. I want to make this object larger, let's say, but I don't want to make it larger skewed in this way because now it's not centered anymore. Okay, I just did Control Z for undo. I know that this point should remain unchanged. So I can click on that. So the x and y coordinates of this point won't change. And now I can modify this object by changing its width. So let's say I want this to be 4" wide. This gives me an object that's 4" wide, but always fixing this point to where it is. Okay, so let's try to do something different. If I now click this point and I make the width even larger, it wouldn't keep, it'll move this, it'll keep this point fixed. So let's try that. So I will do 8 inches now, and you will see that the center point moved till here because I had selected this point to be unchanged. So this is a very nice way of transforming objects by especially when they're in relation to each other. There's this button over here which constrains the width and height. So now if I change the width to 5 inches, the height will accordingly change. and so on and so forth. So these are some basic rectangle drawing features. Again, within rectangle, if you press for a long period of time, you will get other shapes. There's a rounded rectangle, which is straightforward. There's an ellipse tool that we use a lot. Ellipse tool basically makes an ellipse, as the name suggests. An ellipse also can be represented by 4 numbers, and you can figure out, and all of the transform features continue to apply to an ellipse. The only thing to know about an ellipse is that, just like image J actually, is when you hold the shift key, which is what I'm doing now, and try to make an ellipse, it forces the object to have a 1:1 aspect ratio and makes a circle. So this is helps you while trying to make a circle. It's a quick way of making a circle. The circle, of course, can be compressed into an ellipse if you like, and so on and so forth. Even within a circle, you can add anchor points and go back to your other selection tool and move it around. So you can make very interesting shapes like that. So those basics continue. Okay, let's start with the clean slate. The other important thing we'll look at now is arrowheads. This is something we use a lot while making figures. Let's say you have let's say you have a figure that I have imported, or rather, why don't we start with this object that we had here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, let me start with this figure, and now I want to make labels on it. So I want to tell the reader that this is my reaction zone. So I want to put an arrow on this, right? So I put a line, but I want an arrowhead on the right side. So where can you do that? Under stroke. Now, stroke is basically, it represents this line. So we said that you can increase the stroke width or the line width by doing that. But within stroke, you'll see a few options. There's a dashed line. If you click that, it becomes dashed. And this is very cool. You can choose the dash and gap here. So here I've set it to 2 points and 2 points, and this is what it makes. If I make it 3 points and 3 points, it will accordingly widen the gap. And the coolest feature of this is that you can even do a more intricate pattern. You can do 2 3 4 2 3 4 and so on and so forth. I don't want a dashed line right now. I want arrowheads though. So there are 2 arrowheads, one on the right side of this. Usually for all the figures I always make, I always use arrow type 2. So it's something to keep in mind. If I want an arrow on the other side, I can make an arrow here also, an arrowhead 2. Often you'll find that sometimes these arrowheads are too large for what we need. For example, here if I wanted to, this is the text writing tool, by the way, type tool. This is just a straightforward thing. Click there, click wherever I want to write, and I say signal generation area. I can, yeah, and I drag it and keep it over here. And I think that the size of the arrowhead is a little bit more than what I want. So first of all, I don't want this arrowhead, so I can go back and say none. And here I can choose that instead of 100%, I want only 70% of that size, which I think now does pretty well. In my experience, in almost all the arrows that we make in Illustrator using this method, you will almost never be working with 100% arrow. You can also, and we'll look at this in part 2, I'll give you a bunch of reference figures which you can look at always while making your figure. So it'll give a good idea of how the arrowheads should look and fonts should look and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is about arrowhead. Let's see, anything else to be said here? No, not much. I think that covers arrowheads. Okay, so let's see where we are. So one concept I forgot to cover in this is the concept of dots per inch in a rastered image. It basically just means that in a pixelated image, the DPIs is basically the number of pixels per inch when you're printing it. And so you'll often find journals saying that the figures should be 300 DPI, 96 DPI. That's all what it means. And in Illustrator, we can export images in different DPI. So we'll come to that again in part 2. For now, let's see where we are. So we covered rectangles, circles, lines, arcs. Customized shapes is basically just by adding or deleting anchor points and making whatever kinds of shapes you want. We looked at arrowheads. Editing shapes, again, there's several ways of doing it, but again, mostly based on the anchor points. We'll look at merging and splitting shapes. So one thing, so let's start with the clean canvas here. You have a rectangle. One of the advantages of So if you see, there's no triangle tool in Illustrator. So if I want to make some form of a triangle, what I always do to make a triangle is I start with a rectangle and I go with the delete anchor point tool, and you can delete any of these anchor points, and I do that, it forms a triangle. So as simple as that. If you want to make a even more intricate shape, actually let's make one which we'll use in some time. Let me put two more anchor points here and go back to my other selection tool. I want something that looks like this, and I'll show you soon why we need this. Okay, but this also gives you an idea of how I can very easily make any customized shape that I want. So let's keep this aside. For now, I will show you one interesting feature where you want to merge objects or subtract one shape from another. So for example, if you want to make a ring, let's say, of something. So I can start with the ellipse tool, hold down the shift button and make a circle. And let me, so one thing I didn't cover is again the stroke and the path. So stroke is the color of the line and the path is the fill color. So far we haven't filled anything. So I can fill a yellow color here. Okay. So basically I made a yellow circle. Let me make another circle that's slightly smaller, and let me give it a different color, say green. Okay, and I want to make a ring from this. Go back to my default selection tool. I hold the center of this and snap it onto the center of the other object. Okay, so now I have green object in front of the yellow object. By the way, just like PowerPoint, you have these things of arranging where you can bring things to front or send them to back. So if I send the green circle to back, I won't be able to see it because it went behind the yellow. So then I again click on the yellow and I say I want the yellow to be back, behind, send to back. Okay, now I can select both of these and I want to subtract the green circle from the yellow circle. So any of these subtraction union kind of operations are done through, you go under window. By the way, under window you have all of these action tools here. Anything you click opens up as a small window on the right side here. So I already have layers. No, I'm looking for pathfinder. Whenever you want to merge objects or do anything with it, you look at an object called pathfinder. So I click on that and this window opens up. I have already selected these two. I'm going to use this thing called as minus front. As soon as I click on it, it minuses, it subtracts this front thing off, and what I get is a ring. So this is how you can make rims or rings or things like that. So I undid that by doing Control Z, just so that we can look at some other features. If I have two objects and I want to make a union of those, I can select those, and this is the unite option. So it makes them into a single object. Let's see if I can unite all three. Okay, so this is how you can make interesting objects. So again, I'm going to undo that, and you can play with, this is a union, this is a subtraction. There are things like intersect. So if I do the intersection of these two, I should get just that region, and so on and so forth. So these are mostly the only three that I ever use. These three over here. Okay, so that tells you something about modifying objects. Now let's go to an interesting feature which is of 3D objects. This is something that we use. It helps you make really nice schematics with Illustrator. So there are two basic operations within 3D. Let's start also with a rectangle. Okay, a square rather. Okay. So first thing I'm going to do under 3D is Effect, 3D. We can either do extrude and bevel or we can do revolve. We do both of these. Extrude and bevel is what we do most often, but let's start with the revolve option now. What revolve basically does, and it'll open up a window, is it's going to revolve this object around some axis, some edge. So for now, it says it's going to revolve it around the left edge. Okay. I can do a preview over here. As soon as you do a preview, you'll see what you see. Okay. What happened here is that the whole object became black because the stroke is black. Now imagine you had, let me unpreview this. Imagine you move this square or rectangle around this axis. Okay, you're basically moving it. It forms a cylinder, but the outside of the cylinder is black because these lines are black. So let me get rid of the stroke completely. Okay, so I only have fill, I don't have a line. Now I can go back and do Effect, 3D, Revolve. Select the left edge and do a preview, and I should see a green cylinder because this object has been rotated around. Now this, I'll do okay here. This enables you to make some very nice and interesting objects. So for example, let's go to this guy again, get rid of the stroke. This will allow you to rotate this circle. Let's try to rotate it around the left edge. So effect 3D revolve around the left edge preview. This makes a very interesting donut shaped object, and Illustrator gives these nice light rendition effects and everything also. Okay, this I made because you can get a very nice let me let me fill it up with some yellow color and get rid of the line, and let me revolve this around the left edge. Sorry, I did the wrong option there. I want to revolve it left edge, and I preview that. So I see a very nice interesting shape here where it's almost like a dish or a cup or something. So there's just no limit here. You can use your creativity to make any kinds of objects using the revolve thing. There's also an option to offset, I believe. So let's see, I take this effect 3D rotate, so I don't necessarily have to revolve it. Sorry, I went into rotate there. Revolve. You can say you rotate it around the left edge offset by a certain number of points. So I haven't tried this. Let's see what happens here. I think this will make a more complex object. You see how much time it's taking to render because this is something complicated we are asking it to do. So let's see what it does. Okay, and let's get rid of the stroke. Let me do okay here. Let's get rid of the stroke. And okay, well, it wasn't all that useful. It basically just made a slightly larger donut. Anyways, you get the idea. So I'll delete everything. The next thing we'll look at is extrude and bevel. This is one of our sort of workhorses that we use in the lab. This is whenever we want to make schematics of 3D objects or layered devices or something like that. So let's try to do a simple thing. I have a piece of paper and I want to this is representing a piece of paper, and I now want to get a rim of plastic which is exactly the same size, but it's just a rim. Okay, so let me try to make this width is 1.5, let's say height is 1 inch. Okay, what happened here is that because the width and height are constrained, I can't change them independently, so I unconstrain them. I say I want the width to be 2 inch, height to be 1 inch. So that's the rectangle I made, and now I want to make a rim from this. Okay, so what I can do is I can make another rectangle, but I want the rim to be 0.1 inch on all sides, and therefore the width of this should be 2 minus 0.2, which is 1.8 inch, and the height should be 1 minus 0.2, which is 0.8 inches. Okay, let me give this a different color, and again I can move this on top here, and that's basically the rim that I want to make. So before I do anything else, I want to copy this object and keep here because I'm going to subtract the front from this off now. Okay, so I made a rim. I made another. Let's say this is my piece of paper. Let me give this some gray color here. Okay. Now I want to show the user that these two layers are going to be placed one on top of another. So what we do here is we use effect 3D extrude and bevel. The extrude depth is what will decide the depth by which you're going to extrude it, obviously. So let me preview this. By the way, we always do isometric top. There's different views here. I'll show you what that means. Do isometric top and preview this. This is showing me the object which is extruded by 5 points from the isometric top. But I can look at it from the isometric right. I can look at it from the isometric left and from many other directions. But I usually always use isometric top. Okay, I extruded this by 5 points in this direction. Let's keep that there. Then I do the same thing with this effect 3D extrude and bevel. Let's say this is slightly thicker, so I do 10 points, isometric top, and I preview that, and I made that rim now, and I said okay. By the way, once you change or do a 3D rendition, if you want to then go and change this, you can't. If you go back to 3D extrude and bevel, that won't work because this effect has already been incorporated. So you click the object. Under appearance, you will see this 3D extrude and bevel. So if you click on that, the same settings will come and you can now modify this. Let's say I only want this to be 7 points. Okay, so I was able to modify it. Now I arrange these things in such a way that makes it very clear to the user that I am keeping them one on top of another. I want this rim to be on top of the paper. So I can say arrange, bring to front. Okay. And I can manually keep this right on top. And if I zoom in, it appears that a rim has been placed on top of a piece of paper. Um, let's say I wanted this rim underneath it. So let's try to do that. I say arrange, send to back. But now I can't see it, right? Now I can do something like this, but it doesn't appear to the user that it's a rim. It appears that it could be just two layers of, solid two layers. So I can change the opacity of this thing. So this is opaque, or this is 100% opaque. I can make it 50% opaque, or 70, oops, or 70% opaque. So when I do that, I can still give the appearance that I have a top layer underneath which I have the rim. So you can basically make whatever shapes, extrude them and arrange them in whatever way. And what I have done with these methods in the past is I'll show you some figures that have been made using this method. So this is one of the recent figures that was made where all of these objects were first made in 2D and then extruded and beveled using different lengths, heights of extrusion. And then they were put together and arrows were shown. So this is a very nice way of showing typically what we do in a lab where we arrange layers of paper on top of each other. This is a nice way. So this is completely done using the extrude and bevel feature. You can do even more intricate objects. Even this thing was made using the same feature. So every part on this was first made in 2D and then extruded and beveled. Transparencies were changed and everything was arranged. You can see here there's a transparent part over here. This part resides on top of that. That part here is transparent. So it takes some time, but you can make some very nice looking figures using this. So that's on how to make 3D objects. So we went to extrude, bevel and revolve. Last thing we'll look real quick in this is the concept of layers and toggling visibility and locking. Okay, so let's put some random objects on this canvas. Okay, let's have 4 objects here, 1, 2, 3 and 4. One thing you can do is when you go under window and layers, you'll have this layers window open up. What it is showing me here is that I have only one layer now, which is a blue colored layer, which means that all objects on this layer, when I select, they appear as blue. Before I go into layers, let me tell you about locking and toggling visibility. If you click on this arrow under layer 1, you will see all the objects in this layer as a list. And if you click on the object, you'll see a corresponding blue mark over here. Okay. If there is some reason for which I want to keep an object over here and I want to draw around it such that I don't edit this in any way, I can go ahead, I click this, I see this over here, I can say lock. When I lock this object becomes unselectable. I can select everything around it but not this object. Now I can draw right on top of this, right on top of this by whichever method, and it wouldn't affect that. So this is a useful feature you may be able to use sometimes. You could go even further without locking. You could say that I don't want to see this object at all. Okay. When you do that, you can now go ahead with your drawing, assuming that it's not there, and in the end you click on visibility again, it appears exactly where it was. So these kind of things help you when you're doing more, could potentially help you when you're doing more complex kind of drawings. And the last thing in this is layers. So as I said, we have only one layer. So let's say I click here and say new layer. This new layer, it says, has to be, I can choose whichever color. Let's say it's a red color. I say okay. A second layer came. I can click either on layer 1 or on layer 2. When I click on layer 2, any new object I make comes in layer 2. So now you see it's selected in the red. Let's fill some brown color in this. If I make a line here, it will be selected in the red. Okay, so now I have 2 layers, and let's see what happens when I put one on top of another. So right now the brown and these lines, because they are in layer 2, the red layer, here I am clearly telling Illustrator the layer 2 is on top of layer 1, but I can switch that. I say I want layer 1 on top of layer 2, and now all the objects in layer 1, blue layers, come in front of layer 2. So this is also something if you're trying to make assemblies, where if you're doing a layer by layer paper device, you could use this concept to first draw the objects on the bottom layer, lock them, and then make a second layer, use the bottom layer shapes as a reference to make shapes on top of that, and so on and so forth. So the not all of these tools will be used in any single figure, but I think I have told you almost all the different um, almost all the different features that I've used so far. So that's last thing. I don't have that in my bullet list, but let's quickly look at text. So if you write some text here, uh, the default is always Myriad Pro. You can go under stroke here. Sorry, you go under character when you want to edit any text, and you can change its font size and stuff. But what you can do is you can do interesting things. So for example, if I want to shrink this by 50% in the vertical direction but not in the horizontal direction, I can do that. If I want to make something appear as if it's superscript, let's say I want lab oratory in superscript, I click on character. I can first reduce its font size to say 8, and then I can offset it, so I can raise it by a few points. Unfortunately, it's not visible. So when I offset it, it actually went up. And so you have amazing levels of customization that you can do with different text. And of course, there's a whole bunch of font sizes. Myriad Pro is something that we tend to do most often. Okay, I think that covers everything I wanted to cover under part 1. With all of these basics in part 2, we will now start to see how to actually take some research data and try to put it into a figure. So with that, I will conclude this part 1 of the Adobe Illustrator tutorial here.